He had once ruled half the world, from the silver mines of the Americas to the burning coasts of Africa, from the mist of Flanders to the islands of the Pacific. Every prayer for dawn carried his name, Philippus Rex. But in the end, the man who had conquered continents could not conquer his own body. It began quietly. A swelling in the foot, a twinge of pain that no physician could soothe. Then came the fever, the ulcers, the smell. By that final September, the palace itself seemed to rot with him. El Escorial, that granite monument to Catholic order, had become a mausoleum for the living. The corridors were heavy with incense, trying and failing to disguise the stench that leaked from the king's chamber, an odor of blood, pus, and sanctity. Inside, Philip lay motionless on a low bed, built so he could see the altar even as he died. His body had become a battlefield. Gangrene had eaten through his leg to the bone. Boils covered his back. The flesh beneath his fingernails had turned black, and his tongue swelled so grotesquely he could no longer speak the prayers he had ordered whispered for him. His physicians bled him, leeched him, cauterized the sores with red-hot irons. None of it worked. The pain was his crown now. Servants wrapped the room in silence. Only the scrape of a rosary breaking the stillness, only the wet crackle of a candle drowning in its own wax. Outside, a storm gathered above the mountains, hurling wind against the windows as if the heavens themselves were impatient. The courtiers kept their distance, crossing themselves whenever the smell drifted down the hall. Even his confessor, that iron-souled Dominican, confessed later that the air around the bed felt cursed. And yet Philip refused to die. For 53 days he lingered, demanding to witness Mass every dawn. They built a small platform so he could stare at the host, his eyes yellow and glassy, his breath rattling like parchment torn in two. He clutched a crucifix carved from bone and murmured that his suffering was holy. But there were moments, fleeting, human, when the mask slipped, when the great Catholic monarch looked not like a martyr, but a man terrified that all his piety had bought him nothing but decay. The empire waited outside that room. Armadas had sunk, provinces had rebelled, heirs plotted, and still their king clung to life, to faith, to the belief that order could be imposed even upon death. Yet the candles kept guttering, the wounds kept weeping, and the stench of mortality spread through stone. By the second week of September, his attendants began to whisper that perhaps this was not illness at all, but judgment. A penance for the Inquisition he had unleashed, for the thousands burned in God's name, for the wars fought under the banner of purity, while his own flesh turned to corruption. In that dim chamber, the idea of divine justice ceased to be metaphor. It had a smell, a sound, a texture. And as the bell of La Escorial tolled for Compline, Philip whispered one final order, a command that would reveal far more about his soul than any battle he ever fought. But to understand that command, and why even the priests hesitated to obey, we must first return to the beginning, to the prince raised among ghosts, and to the empire that would rot with him. He was born in Valladolid, in the spring of 1527, when Spain stood at the height of its glory and believed itself chosen by God. His father, Emperor Charles V, ruled an empire so vast that the sun indeed never set upon it. His mother, Isabella of Portugal, gave him the stillness that would one day harden into silence. But the child himself was an unsettling presence, pale, precise, grave beyond his years. Even the nurses whispered that he never laughed. From the beginning, Philip was bred not to live, but to rule. Tutors drilled him in Latin, scripture, and the fine mathematics of obedience. When other boys rode horses, he traced maps. When they played with wooden swords, he practiced signing decrees. His father's court was filled with the noise of battles and music. Philip preferred the quiet click of rosary beads. In a world of exuberant warriors, he was a statue already. When he was 16, They brought him the corpse of a rebel hanged in Flanders and told him this was how one preserved order. He did not flinch. He only asked whether the man had confessed before dying. Those who saw him then spoke of a boy already possessed by piety, an almost mathematical faith, that sin could be measured and corrected like a ledger. The curse, if one can call it that, was invisible but thorough. From his Habsburg ancestors he inherited a chin so swollen and twisted that it made chewing painful, a jaw that would trap his words in his throat. From his upbringing he inherited isolation, a belief that affection was weakness, that love could rot like unsealed grain. It was a cruel education for a future king, and it shaped him more than any tutor. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, he left his son not only the crown of Spain, but the weight of divine expectation. Philip was 28 and already devout to the edge of fanaticism. His empire stretched across the seas, yet his eyes rarely lifted from the crucifix. "Better not to rule at all," he once said, "than to rule without God's favor." But God's favor, he believed, could be enforced. He reorganized the Inquisition, turning it from tribunal to instrument. He married 4 times alliances, more than love's burying 3 wives in quick succession. Each death made him pray longer, fast harder, rule colder. When England's Queen Mary died childless, he wept not for her, but for the crown he would never wear beside her. He saw loss as divine arithmetic. Every sorrow must yield a gain in heaven. In the marble corridors of El Escorial, which he built later as both palace and monastery, he planned a world purified of error. The walls were stone, the colors gray, the air heavy with incense and restraint. He designed even the geometry himself, calculating how each window would funnel light toward the altar, an empire of symmetry in a world of chaos. But symmetry can become a coffin when no light is allowed to move freely. By the time his second decade of rule began, the rebellion in the Netherlands was tearing that perfect order apart. Cities burned. Soldiers mutinied. Faith fractured. And in the distance, storms gathered across the Atlantic that even a king could not command. It was then, as the empire began to bleed, that the first real cracks appeared not in marble or map, but in Philip himself. He began to believe that every failure, every rebellion, was a test from God, and that to pass it he must purge even harder. The more he prayed, the lonelier he became. The more he punished, the more he sinned. By his 40th year, the boy who never laughed had become a man who could not sleep. His kingdom was vast, his conscience narrow, and his shadow lengthened over Europe like a passing plague. And soon, that shadow would turn inward, until the empire itself began to mirror the sickness that was quietly consuming its king. Power hardened him. What had begun as piety evolved into obsession, an endless campaign to stamp order upon a world that refused to obey. Philip ruled not through charisma, but through paper. Every decision, every punishment, every mercy required his signature. He slept beside dispatches, rising before dawn to dictate new decrees in a hand so precise it resembled prayer. He believed that discipline itself was divine. But beneath the seal wax and parchment lay fear. He feared rebellion more than war, sin more than death. And so he governed by strangulation, tightening until nothing could move without his consent. In the Netherlands, his soldiers burned heretics by the hundreds. In Spain, the Inquisition's prisons swelled with whispers. Jews who had converted but not enough. Moors who had prayed the wrong way. Women whose only crime was healing with herbs. Philip read the reports carefully and underlined the word mercy whenever it appeared, then crossed it out. He demanded purity, yet his empire fed on impurity. The gold that lined his chapels came from mines where men suffocated in the dark. The silver that paid his armies was melted from the suffering of Mexico and Peru. The king who called himself the most Catholic monarch, presided over a machine of extraction that left the world bleeding. He was capable of tenderness, but only toward symbols. He caressed relics, not people. When his son Don Carlos defied him, Philip ordered the boy imprisoned within his own palace. For 6 months, the prince screamed for release. None came. The guards later reported that Carlos died thin as a candle, his teeth broken from biting the door. The king did not attend the burial. He simply knelt and whispered, "God's will is done." Those words became a refrain. When famine struck Castile, God's will is done. When his ship sank beneath English cannon fire, God's will is done. When villages emptied to pay for wars, they never saw, God's will is done. Each loss only convinced him that he must press harder, purge deeper, pray longer. He mistook endurance for faith, and cruelty for righteousness. In El Escorial, he designed a chamber without music, without color, only stone and echoes. He called it the Room of Reflection. He spent hours there, motionless, while courtiers waited outside listening to the faint sound of fingernails tapping on wood. Some said he conversed with saints. Others whispered he spoke to no one, that the silence had begun to speak back. Letters from his ministers grew fearful. They pleaded for leniency in the Netherlands, for peace with England, for restraint in Portugal. Philip answered none of them directly. He would simply send back a single phrase written in his narrow hand. The king's path is narrow, but it leads to heaven. Yet even heaven began to seem far away. The empire stretched so wide that orders took months to arrive, and rebellions years to crush. Each success bled him further. He spent fortunes on armies that vanished into mud, built ships that never returned, and held councils that lasted longer than the men who attended them. He aged into ritual, kneeling, writing, fasting, commanding. His life became a sequence of obligations carved into time itself. And behind that marble composure, something began to rot. The pain in his leg grew worse. The ulcers on his hand refused to heal. Each morning the physicians lanced new sores. Each evening new ones formed. The man who ruled the world could no longer trust his own flesh. He told his confessor, it was a blessing to suffer in imitation of Christ. But others saw it differently. They saw a monarch whose body was becoming the mirror of his empire, bloated, bleeding, incapable of change. A kingdom diseased by obedience, and a king eaten alive by his own devotion. And as the smell of corruption began to follow him through the palace corridors, one question echoed through Spain, like a curse. If the king's body was holy, what did it mean that God had chosen to make it rot? By the time the English armada sailed, Philip was already half a ghost. He watched from a high window in El Escorial as courtiers carried maps across the marble floor like pallbearers at a funeral. The empire that had once devoured worlds was devouring itself, its veins clogged with taxes, its armies unpaid, its faith exhausted. But he would not surrender. He could not. To yield, even to reason, was to admit that God's design had erred. He saw the storm that destroyed his fleet as proof of divine testing, not defeat. When word came that the ships had sunk off Ireland and the survivors had been butchered on the beaches, he bowed his head and whispered, "Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done." And yet, in private, he broke the crucifix he held, driving a splinter into his palm until the Barictua. Blood ran down his wrist. The wound festered for months, joining the others that mottled his skin. Soon even his bones felt brittle, as if the empire's weight had pressed into the marrow. His counselors began to die faster than he could replace them. The Duke of Alba, his iron general, fell. His half-brother, Don John, perished before his time. Even his confessor, the one man who dared to argue with him, coughed his lungs out in the same cold corridors where Philip prayed for miracles that never came. One by one, the lights around him extinguished, until only the king remained burning weakly, stubbornly, like a candle fighting against its own smoke. Spain itself reflected the decline. The silver fleets from the New World grew smaller. The gold grew thinner. Villages emptied as peasants fled conscription. Fields turned to dust, while cathedrals multiplied. And still, Philip ordered more wars against heresy, against England, against time. He believed that if he simply held his breath long enough, history would yield to holiness. But faith cannot pay soldiers, and prayer cannot feed the hungry. When famine swept through Castile, mothers sold their wedding rings for bread and found only ashes. Chroniclers wrote that the streets of Madrid smelled of wax and decay, the same odor that clung to the king's own chamber. Rumors spread that the land was cursed, that Spain's suffering was the reflection of its rulers' sins. One monk even dared to preach that the body of the monarch and the body of the realm are one flesh. For that sermon, he was quietly erased from the record. But the idea lingered, whispered in taverns and cloisters alike, that God was punishing Spain through the body of its king. By 1590, Philip's world had narrowed to stone walls and petitions. He spent his nights seated upright in a wooden chair, because lying down caused the ulcers on his back to burst. His attendants changed the linens hourly, though the stench of rot never faded. He kept writing orders even as his fingers stiffened with gout, demanding that cities he had never seen remain obedient to a God they could no longer find. Each decree was an echo of the man he used to be, command without consequence, faith without mercy. The empire obeyed out of inertia, not devotion. It was as though the machinery of conquest had continued turning after the engineer was already dead, and yet, through the veil of pain and exhaustion, Philip still believed he was chosen. He spoke often of Job, of the righteous man tested by affliction. But unlike Job, he found no comfort in revelation, only the grinding certainty that his suffering must mean something. If his flesh was rotting, it was because the world was impure. If the world rebelled, it was because faith was weak. He mistook decay for purpose, and in doing so, he bound his soul to the very thing that was killing him. By the mid-1590s, his body had become a reliquary of disease, swollen joints, infected leg, open sores from the waist down. He could barely hold the quill, yet he continued to sign orders. Every signature looked shakier than the last, as if the ink itself trembled with foreknowledge. And when at last the ministers begged him to rest, to delegate, to release control, Philip only smiled through cracked lips and said, "A king does not die until God commands it." But God, it seemed, had been commanding it for years. The empire waited for his final collapse, like a patient waiting for the surgeon's blade, terrified of the pain, desperate for the cure. And in that waiting, Spain began to drift, hollow and leaderless, toward the edge of its own decline. Because as Philip's body withered, so too did the illusion of divine order. The throne still stood, gleaming in the half-light of El Escorial, but the man who sat upon it was already a corpse, wearing a crown. The smell reached the courtyard before the priests did. It was said that even the marble seemed to sweat with it, an odor thick as candle wax, sharp as copper. Within the king's chamber, windows were sealed against the flies, but still they found their way through the cracks, drawn by the scent of what had once been royal flesh. Philip had become his own reliquary. He no longer wore his crown, for the ulcers on his scalp made any weight unbearable. The sores on his legs had fused with the sheets, so that each attempt to move tore open fresh wounds. His fingernails fell away one by one. The physicians collected them in a silver bowl, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of reverence. He whispered that the pain was his staircase to heaven. But even heaven, by then, smelled like decay. Each morning they dressed him in clean linen soaked with herbs, though no fragrance could hide the infection. A brazier burned nearby, filled with cedar and myrrh. The air shimmered with heat and prayer. His confessor sat close, reading from the book of Job. "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away." Philip nodded, lips trembling, but said nothing. He could no longer swallow without bleeding. The sores on his legs had deepened into black caverns. His attendants lanced them daily, releasing a stench that made even the most devout knights stagger back. Yet the king endured. He demanded that Mass continue every dawn, even if he had to be lifted upright on pillows to see the altar. He called his agony a divine imitation, his flesh the altar, his blood the offering. Those who served him no longer knew whether they were watching a saint or a punishment. On the 50th day, the delirium began. He spoke to ghosts, to his father Charles, to the son he had locked away, to wives long buried. Sometimes he wept, muttering prayers in a child's voice. Sometimes he shouted orders no one could understand. He clutched the crucifix until his palm split, the ivory darkened by blood. The courtiers whispered that the crucifix was beginning to rot as well, its polished surface turning porous under his touch. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. The sky hung heavy and brown, as if the storm itself hesitated to strike. Inside, the king's pulse flickered, like the candle beside him. Long pauses, then furious bursts. A surgeon begged to amputate the infected leg. Philip refused. "How can I meet my maker incomplete?" he rasped. So they left the leg to devour him. The gangrene spread, the skin blackened, and the stench deepened into something inhuman. By September, his attendants worked in shifts of minutes, not hours. Some fainted from the fumes. Others confessed their sins before entering the room, fearing that to breathe the air was to invite damnation. They washed the floor with wine, sprinkled holy water over his bed, and prayed that God would end it soon. But the king endured still, his will clinging to the throne even as his body disintegrated around it. At last, on the 13th of September, he called for the crucifix of his father, the same one Charles V had held on his deathbed. They placed it in his hands, brittle and shaking. He pressed it to his mouth and whispered that the world was finally clean. Moments later, his eyes rolled back, and a sound escaped him, not a sigh, not a groan, but a gurgle, wet and final. The king who had ruled oceans died drowning in his own corruption. They said the blood that spilled from his mouth stained the pillow in the shape of a crown. And when the priests carried his body to the mortuary table, the sheets tore away half his skin. It took 4 days to prepare him for burial. Even embalming could not silence the smell. And yet, as his coffin left El Escorial, something strange happened. The stench lifted. The air cleared. A wind swept through the corridors, scattering the incense, the prayers, and the fear. Some swore they heard bells ringing by themselves, faint and distant. Others said it was only the storm outside. But all agreed on one thing: Spain itself seemed to exhale, as if a long, dreadful possession had finally ended. And from that breath, from that decay, a new Spain would begin to rise, built not on conquest, but on memory. They buried him beneath the high altar of El Escorial, his own creation, his granite dream of eternity. The bells tolled for hours, and the monks chanted until their voices cracked, each syllable vanishing into the stone he had designed to outlive them all. Philip had ordered every inch of the mausoleum himself, the stairs that descend like confession, the echo that swallows sound before it reaches heaven. He wanted his body to rest within the bones of faith. But faith, like flesh, had begun to decay. When the masons sealed the tomb, they placed him beside his father and his sons, a dynasty entombed within its own monument. It was supposed to be eternal, a visible kingdom of God. Yet within months, cracks appeared in the marble. Moisture seeped from the walls. The air grew thick again, faintly sour. Pilgrims whispered that the rot had returned. In Madrid, courtiers spoke of omens. The skies turned yellow that autumn. Locusts devoured the fields near Toledo. Ships from the Americas arrived half empty. Even the priests began to question whether Spain's suffering had truly ended or merely changed shape. They quoted scripture, "Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." It was hard to tell whether they meant the empire or the king, And yet, from his death came a strange calm. His successor, Philip III, was gentle, pliant, easily led, a boy raised among shadows. He had none of his father's ferocity, none of his intellect, and none of his pain. Under him, the Inquisition softened. Wars slowed. The treasury, though nearly empty, stopped bleeding. Spain exhaled. The silence that followed felt almost merciful. Historians would later call it decline, but to those who lived it, it felt like healing. They remembered Philip II as both saint and tyrant, the man who tried to purify the world and ended up purifying only himself. Poets wrote of his death as auto da fe, a ritual burning, where the soul, not the heretic, was consumed. Painters returned to color. Churches filled again with music. It was as if the light he had suppressed for 40 years seeped slowly back through the cracks in his tomb. Irony has a long memory. The same monarch who drowned Europe in blood in the name of order gave birth to an age of introspection, of conscience. His empire shrank, but his legend grew whispered in the corridors of power, as warning, not glory. Do not reign as he did, ministers would caution new kings. Do not mistake silence for peace, nor fear for faith. And yet every monarch who came after him studied his rule with awe. Because in his fall lay a pattern that power never forgets, that control promises salvation and delivers decay. Centuries later, when scholars opened his crypt, they found the bones intact, wrapped in linen darkened by time. The odor, witnesses wrote, still lingered faintly in the air, resin and corruption intertwined. Some said it was a miracle, the persistence of sanctity. Others said it was a warning, the ghost of power refusing to fade. Whatever the truth, the lesson was clear. The empire he forged through faith and fear had long since crumbled, but the memory of his body rotting, radiant, unrepentant, had become Spain's most enduring sermon. And in that sense, Philip II did not die a failure. He became what he had always wanted to be, a man whose suffering proved that even kings are mortal, and that even rot can sanctify. For in the kingdom of history, the smell of a dead king lasts longer than the perfume of his saints. Hold that image for a moment, the stone corridors of El Escorial, breathing in silence, the faint trace of incense tangled with something older, something human. 4 centuries have passed, yet the air inside still carries the weight of him, the king who believed suffering could sanctify, the man who mistook stillness for order and obedience for faith. If you listen closely, the monastery hums, not with prayer, but with memory. Each echo is a reminder that the body of a ruler and the body of a nation decay the same way, slowly, beautifully, inevitably. Granite softens, scripture fades, and power, once absolute, ends in breath and bone. Philip's death did not destroy Spain. It exposed her. The empire that had called itself eternal learned to live within its limits, to measure holiness by humility rather than conquest. For every heretic he burned, new thinkers would later rise to question. For every war he blessed, new artists would paint mercy. Even decay can be fertile, if history is patient enough to listen. The philosophers who came after him would say that he embodied the paradox of faith, that the desire to be pure can make us monstrous, that the more tightly we cling to control, the faster the rot spreads. They wrote of him not as a villain, but as a mirror, because in the end, all power carries within it the same infection, the belief that eternity can be built from flesh. And yet, there is a strange tenderness in his story. He suffered not for greed, but for certainty. He wanted the world to make sense, to kneel, to pray in one voice. And in trying to save it, he destroyed himself. Few tyrants can claim such symmetry between sin and punishment. His agony was not imposed. It was chosen, sanctified, embraced. He became his own Inquisition, and his body the verdict. If you walk through El Escorial today, the light still falls in measured lines exactly as he designed. It touches the tomb, then vanishes into shadow, as if even the sun obeyed his geometry. Visitors move quietly, unsure whether to pray or to pity. Because the man who built this palace for God left behind something more honest than any sermon, a warning carved in stone and skin. So remember this: power will always promise purity. It will always whisper that order justifies pain, but history smells what marble hides. Every empire, every leader, every faith that demands perfection eventually meets the same end: a silence that stinks of devotion. Perhaps that is Philip's final gift to us. Not his wars, nor his cathedrals, but the truth that holiness without compassion is only another form of decay. And so the question remains: when our own kingdoms begin to crumble, will we recognize the rot as punishment or as mercy?